Group of 7 arrived at the remote mountain Airbnb just as the sun dipped behind the pines. The house was an architectural oddity of sharp angles and floor-to-ceiling glass. In the basement, buried beneath loose floorboards, they found a box of rusted iron. Against the better judgment of most, they pried it open. Inside sat a stone figurine, elongated and smooth, with a face that lacked features. The air in the room grew heavy, turning frigid. That night, Kate saw him. He was impossibly tall, his limbs like knotted rope stretching toward the vaulted ceiling. He stood in the corner of the living room, his head tilted at a nauseating angle. When Nate stood up to investigate a noise, the entity lunged. Nate didn't scream, he simply vanished into the shadows of the hallway, leaving only his phone behind. Panic fractured the group. Sammy and Jesse tried to make a run for the car, but the entity moved with a fluid, liquid grace, cutting through the architecture of the house as if walls were merely suggestions. Sammy was pulled upward into the rafters. The sound of snapping bone was the only indication he was gone. The remaining 5, Kevin, Heather, Alice, Kate, and Jesse, made it to the local hospital, desperate for safety under the fluorescent lights. They were huddled in a sterile waiting room. The security guard went to check the perimeter and never returned. The lights began to pulse. The entity didn't walk through the doors. It unfolded itself through the ceiling tiles. Kevin stood to fight, but the creature's hand, ending in fingers that reached the floor, clamped over his face. He was dragged into the ceiling space, his legs kicking briefly before the tiles snapped shut. Jesse tried to pull a fire alarm, but the entity stepped between him and the wall. It bent down, its featureless face pressing against Jesse's. Jesse stopped moving. He simply stood there as his skin turned a shade of gray, his eyes rolling back until only the whites remained. He was still breathing, but he was no longer there. Heather and Alice bolted. They drove back to the house, the only place they felt they knew, fueled by the irrational fear that everywhere else was worse. They sprinted inside and barricaded the basement door. They sat in the living room, gripping each other's hands. The house was silent, save for the rhythmic thud of the entity moving on the roof above them. It descended the chimney. The soot-covered form stood in the center of the room. It towered over them, casting a long, jagged shadow that seemed to consume the light. It reached out for Heather, but Alice grabbed a heavy iron fire poker and swung it with everything she had, striking the creature's knee. The entity buckled, a sound like grinding stone erupting from its frame. It didn't retaliate. Instead, it retreated into the wall, dissolving into the structure of the house itself. The house went deathly still. The weight in the air lifted. Heather and Alice sat on the floor, shivering, watching the spot where the entity had stood. The nightmare had stopped, but the house remained, forever marked by the long, dark indentations left in the walls where he had passed. They were alive, but as they looked at each other, they knew they would spend the rest of their lives waiting for the floorboards to creak. The front door stood wide open, letting in the freezing mountain air. Heather's grip on Alice's hand was so tight her knuckles had turned white. "We have to go," Alice said, her voice shaking. She stood up, pulling Heather with her. They moved toward the entrance, their eyes fixed on the ceiling, the floor, and the corners of the room. Every shadow stretched and warped in the dim light, mimicking the reach of the entity's long, knotted limbs. As they reached the threshold, the front door slammed shut with a force that rattled the glass walls of the house. Alice lunged for the handle, but it was locked solid. She hammered her fist against the wood. "Open it!" A slow, grinding sound came from the floorboards beneath them. They both jumped back as the wood splintered upward. A single, spindly finger, longer than a man's forearm, poked through the gap in the floor. It began to trace a circle around their feet, the wood shredding like paper under its touch. Heather grabbed a lamp from the side table and swung it, shattering the bulb against the floor. But the entity didn't recoil. It began to pull itself upward, the rest of its hand unfolding from the darkness below. The kitchen, Heather commanded. They sprinted across the living room. Behind them, the floorboards erupted. The entity stood fully upright, its head pressing against the ceiling, forced to stoop. It didn't rush. It simply placed one foot in front of the other, its movements deliberate and heavy. They reached the kitchen and slammed the heavy oak door, sliding a metal cart in front of it. "There's no way out," Alice realized, staring at the small, high window above the sink. It was too narrow for them to squeeze through. The entity reached the kitchen door. It didn't try to force it open. Instead, a long, thin limb slid through the gap between the door and the frame, snake-like, searching for the latch. Heather picked up a sharp kitchen knife from the counter, her eyes locked on the space near the hinges. As the pale gray finger poked through to catch the lock, she brought the blade down with everything she had. The knife struck deep, sinking into the creature's flesh. It didn't bleed red. Instead, a thick black oil seeped from the wound. The entity let out a low, vibrating hum that made the plates on the shelves rattle and crack. It pulled its hand back, and the kitchen door groaned under a sudden, immense pressure. The wood began to bow inward. Alice grabbed Heather by the shoulder, pulling her toward the back door that led to the garage. "Forget the front. The garage door is manual." They scrambled for the inner door, wrenching it open just as the kitchen door splintered off its hinges. The entity stepped into the kitchen, its frame filling the entire space, its featureless head turning toward them. They dove into the garage and slammed the door shut, locking it from the inside. They didn't stop for breath. They ran to the main garage door and grabbed the pull rope, heaving against the weight of the metal. It rose inch by inch until they could scramble out into the night. They didn't look back. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs gave out, stumbling onto the gravel driveway. Only when they reached the edge of the woods, where the house was finally a distant shape in the dark, did they collapse onto the wet grass, gasping for air, listening to the absolute, crushing silence of the mountain. The cold mountain air bit into their skin, but neither girl dared to stand. They huddled together in the tall, damp grass, their gazes locked on the silhouette of the house. The structure loomed against the night sky, its windows dark, its presence suddenly, unnervingly still. Alice's breath came in ragged, jagged hitches. She reached out, trembling, and pressed her palm against Heather's shaking shoulder. "Is it still inside?" Alice mouthed, the words barely making it past her lips. Heather didn't answer. She was staring at the second-floor window. The glass was intact, but a faint, rhythmic pulsing began to emanate from within the frame, a deep, rhythmic light, like a slow-beating heart of black oil. Then the front door of the house creaked open again. It didn't swing wide. It moved with a deliberate, agonizing slowness. A tall, thin shadow detached itself from the interior darkness of the entryway. It did not step out onto the porch. It poured out, its limbs unfolding in unnatural directions, a tangle of joints and elongated fingers that dragged across the wooden slats of the deck. It stopped at the very edge of the porch, where the floodlight beam ended. The entity tilted its head toward them. It had no eyes, no mouth, no nose, just a smooth, pale surface of skin that seemed to absorb the moonlight. Alice scrambled backward on her heels, her nails digging into the dirt. "Don't look at it," she commanded, her voice thin but sharp. "Don't look at the face." They both squeezed their eyes shut, burying their faces against their knees. The silence that followed was absolute. No crickets chirped. No wind moved the branches of the pines. There was only the feeling of being watched, a physical pressure that squeezed the air from their lungs. A heavy, wet sound began to approach, a dragging, suction-like noise that moved through the gravel of the driveway. Slap, drag, slap, drag. It was coming toward them. Alice felt a cold, oily sensation settle on the back of her neck. The air grew impossibly thin, smelling of ozone and stagnant water. The entity was standing directly over them. She could feel the towering height of it, a freezing magnetic pull drawing the warmth right out of her body. "Run," Heather choked out, her voice breaking. They sprang up and bolted into the thicket of the woods. Branches whipped against their faces, tearing at their clothes, but they didn't slow down. Behind them, the trees began to snap. It wasn't the sound of a person walking, it was the sound of something massive, moving through the forest, ignoring the path, crushing everything that stood in its way. Every time they dared to glance back, the long, spindly shadow of the entity was closer, moving not by steps, but by stretching its limbs across the dark terrain. They reached the edge of the service road that led back to the main highway. A pair of headlights flickered in the distance, a truck, moving slowly along the winding road. "Hey!" Alice screamed, waving her arms, her voice cracking in the dark. "Help! Over here!" The truck began to slow down. As the vehicle pulled toward the shoulder, its headlights swung across the tree line. The beam illuminated the woods for a split second, cutting through the darkness. In that flash of light, they saw it. The entity was 10 feet away, its arms raised high, hands fanned out like claws, ready to descend. It caught the full force of the high beams and stopped, its body vibrating as if reacting to the sudden intensity of the light. It curled inward, shielding its face, a sound like tearing metal erupting from its core. The truck driver honked his horn, a harsh, blaring sound that seemed to shatter the entity's focus. Heather and Alice didn't wait. They sprinted the final few yards, throwing themselves toward the passenger side of the truck, clawing at the door handles, desperate to escape the reach of the thing that was no longer chasing them, but waiting for the light to die. The truck driver, a weathered man with startled eyes, slammed the door locks down the moment the girls tumbled into the cab. Heather was sobbing, her fingers digging into the seat upholstery, while Alice was twisted around, staring through the back window of the truck. "Drive!" Alice shrieked, her voice raw. "Just drive!" The driver didn't ask questions. He shifted the truck into gear and punched the accelerator. As the tires spun, spraying gravel, the truck surged forward onto the asphalt. Alice kept her eyes glued to the rear window. The high beams of the truck were still cutting a path behind them, illuminating the edge of the woods. For a heartbeat, there was nothing but shadows and swaying pines. Then, the light caught a glint of pale, smooth skin against the bark of a massive oak. The entity had fully extended itself. It was standing vertically against the tree, its torso twisted at a 90-degree angle, its long arms hanging down toward the ground like dead weight. As the truck picked up speed, the creature didn't pursue. It remained fixed to the tree, its featureless face turned directly toward the retreating red glow of the truck's taillights. It began to vibrate again, a low tectonic hum that they could feel through the vibrating floorboards of the cab. "What is that thing?" the driver stammered, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He glanced in his rearview mirror. "What did you girls do?" "Don't look back," Heather warned, her head bowed between her knees. "Don't look at it." The interior of the truck was cramped and smelled of stale coffee and diesel. The engine roared, a mechanical comfort against the unnatural stillness that still clung to the air. Alice kept her hand on the door handle, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. They rounded a sharp bend in the mountain road, and the woods finally began to thin out, giving way to an open meadow. Alice felt the oppressive weight that had been crushing her chest since the basement of the Airbnb begin to dissipate. The air in the cab lost its frozen, ozone-heavy quality. "We're clear," Alice murmured, though she didn't dare turn around yet. I think it stayed at the tree line." The driver exhaled, a long, shaking breath. "I don't know what you were running from, but you two are lucky I took this shift. This road is usually dead this time of night." He reached for the radio to turn it on, hoping to fill the terrifying silence. But as he moved his hand, the radio emitted only a high-pitched, discordant screech. The lights on the dashboard flickered in time with the sound, turning from green to a dull, sickly black. The truck engine stuttered. Alice's blood turned to ice. She watched as the driver frantically pumped the gas pedal. but the truck began to lose momentum. The headlights, which had been so bright moments ago, dimmed to a faint, sickly yellow glow. "No," Heather choked out, looking up. "No, no, no." The truck rolled to a stop in the middle of the dark, empty road. Outside, the crickets had stopped chirping again. The silence was absolute. From the darkness of the trees they had just passed, a new sound emerged. Not a footstep, but the sound of something shifting, like heavy stone being dragged over wet earth, moving closer to the road. The truck engine died with a final, metallic clunk, leaving the cab in total darkness, save for the dim glow of the moonlight reflecting off the windshield. "It's not here," the driver breathed, his eyes darting to the side mirrors. "It didn't follow us." But Alice was staring at the glass. She saw the reflection of the road behind them, and then she saw the movement. It wasn't behind the truck. It was on top of it. The metal roof groaned, bowing downward under a sudden, massive weight. The structural pillars of the cab began to moan and twist. The entity was crouched on the roof, its long, stringy limbs wrapped around the frame, pulling the metal inward like it was soft clay. The driver screamed as the roof caved in, pinning him against the steering wheel. Glass shattered inward as the windshield popped out of its frame. Heather grabbed Alice's hand, pulling her toward the passenger door. They slammed their feet against the door, the hinges shrieking in protest until the latch snapped. They tumbled out into the road, landing hard on the asphalt. They scrambled to their feet and sprinted, not toward the woods, but down the center of the open road, their lungs burning, their eyes fixed on the distant yellow glow of streetlights, marking the edge of town. Behind them, the truck was being dismantled. They heard the sound of heavy metal being peeled away like foil. They didn't look back until they reached the first streetlight. Panting, they stopped, turning around. The truck was a mangled wreck in the distance, its frame bent into a shape that no machine should ever take. Standing atop the wreckage was the entity. It was perfectly still, its elongated frame silhouetted against the night. As they watched, it began to fold its limbs, tucking them into itself, growing smaller and smaller, until it seemed to shrink into the engine block of the ruined truck. Then the truck's horn blared, a single long, mournful sound that curdled into a distorted, human-like sob before cutting out. Alice and Heather didn't stop running until they hit the paved streets of the town. They found a gas station, where the bright humming neon lights seemed to act as a barrier the creature could not cross. They collapsed under the overhang, shaking, covered in dirt and dry black oil from the encounter in the kitchen. They lived. They survived. But in the weeks that followed, they never stood in a room with a high ceiling again. They moved to separate cities, disconnected their phones, and never mentioned the names of their 5 friends who had vanished. They were alive, but they were not free. Every time they passed a tall, narrow space, a chimney, an elevator shaft, a dark corner, they felt the pressure of a featureless face pressing against the air, waiting for the day the lights would finally flicker out.